They dressed her in silk, then lit the match. Welcome to Buried Edge, I'm your host. Where are you joining us from today? Share it below. You make this community powerful. Now the story begins. The silk did not scream, but it curled. 1,000. White lilies, woven into the hem by pale nuns with blistered fingers, caught the first licks of flame and folded like prayer scrolls offered too late. The bodice blackened at the seams before the flesh beneath surrendered. Lace became latticework for fire, trapping her in a bridal cage she had once worn for ceremony, now worn for slaughter. Beneath the heavy cathedral rafters, a hush fell over the congregation, not born of reverence, but of exquisite, petrified silence. The kind of silence that comes only when something too beautiful to destroy begins to rot before the eyes of a court that demanded it. Perfume turned to poison in the heat, and the waxen skin of the Virgin Mary on the altar seemed to sag in shame as if melting in shared agony. The Queen, adorned in sanctified white, was not merely consumed. She was transfigured into an offering, not to God, not even to justice, but to vengeance dressed in robes of piety. Her scream, when it finally came, did not echo. It held, it hung, and it stayed behind in the stone like smoke in the lungs of time. She had been born into shadowed opulence, a child of incense and decrees, where affection was a currency spent only on portraits and legacy. Her cradle stood beneath a tapestry of martyrdom, St. Agatha's severed breasts rendered in silk above the eyes of a nurse who dared not pray too loudly. From her first cry, she belonged not to a family, but to a bloodline. Her name was stitched into treaties before it was spoken aloud in lullabies. In the realm where papal whispers carried more weight than a mother's arms, her future was plaited into a garland of alliances that wound tighter with every passing year. She was not loved. She was invested. Her father, a duke who smiled only, when vanquishing a rival with ink or iron, saw in her the potential to seal a fragile border through bridal chains. Her mother, a duchess in title but a ghost in essence, watched her with the kind of quiet that comes from a heart long unconsulted. The child became a silhouette of virtue, pale, silent, devout, her every gesture a rehearsal for surrender. 14. She had memorized the names of saints and the sins of queens. Her education was laced with warning: do not weep like Catherine, do not tempt like Eleanor, do not rule like Margaret. Her voice was trained to be low, her gaze downcast, her desires erased before they could articulate themselves. She spent her hours in chapel pews carved by hands now buried, staring up at the wooden eyes of saints who bled for causes they did not choose. And slowly, she learned what it meant to be born sacred and expendable. Her betrothal came not as a surprise but as a summons, a missive sealed in wax declaring her not woman but offering. The groom, a widowed monarch twice her age, was a man of iron reputation and splintered mercy, his name uttered with caution by bishops and blacksmiths alike. His kingdom hungered for legitimacy. Her blood, traced back to Charlemagne himself, was the feast. The wedding was a cathedral theatre, staged more for spectators than for sanctity. The dress, an abomination of silk, gold thread, and virgin white brocade, was tailored not for comfort but for spectacle. Its train dragged like a bridal noose, its bodice cinched with monastic cruelty. Jewels crusted the hem in mockery of martyrdom, each stone a symbol of loyalty purchased in suffering. As she walked the nave, eyes cast downward in imitation of humility, she felt not like a bride but like a lamb with painted hooves. The music soared, but there was no wind in her lungs, only the stillness of fate. She was crowned queen beneath, arches stained with saint's blood, and kissed on the forehead by a man whose fingers smelled faintly of scripture and ash. That night, the consummation of power and flesh was observed through the lattice of royal witnesses, ensuring that sovereignty, entered her not only through law but through breach. But within the opulent prison of marriage, obedience began to fray. The queen, once veiled in meekness, allowed herself the smallest of betrayals, questions. Why must the convents be starved? Why must the daughters of nobles marry like cattle? Why must silence be mistaken for virtue? At first her voice was dismissed as girlish fancy, then as insolence, then as heresy. She took in secret letters from abbesses, spoke in low tones with scholars forbidden at court, read pages not blessed by the bishop's hand. And in doing so, she stepped across an invisible line, the kind that cannot be seen until it coils around the ankles like wire. Her body still belonged to the throne, but her mind, slowly, began to flee. It began quietly, as these unravelings always do, not with madness but with clarity. In the chill hours before matins, when the palace walls sweated mildew and the fire in her chamber had long since coughed its last warmth, she would sit upright in her bed, eyes open but unblinking. She said she was listening. To what she never specified. Some believed it was the saints, others claimed it was the damned. But it was neither. It was her own mind echoing in too vast a chamber. She had spent too many years silenced, and now the thoughts came without order, without permission. They came like moths to candle flame, and each one burned her a little more. The queen, once prized for her poise, began to speak with the cadence of someone narrating her own autopsy. She would describe dreams with clinical precision, the feeling of her lungs filling with sand, the sensation of fire peeling the gold leaf from altar statues. When she laughed, it was too long. When she wept, it was not enough. Her ladies-in-waiting were the first to draw back, frightened less by what she said than by how intently she listened to her own silence afterward. She no longer fasted on holy days. She fasted on days of her own invention. She no longer prayed in Latin. She prayed in the language of her wet nurse, a dead tongue from the eastern marshes, whose words sounded like drowning. The king was troubled not by her sorrow, but by her resistance to it. He had expected her to mourn within the prescribed parameters, thin, pale, and pliant. Instead, she grew angular with rage, elegant in her defiance. She took to wandering the palace gardens alone at night, trailing the wedding gown she insisted on wearing daily, though it grew grey with soil and stained at the cuffs, a holy relic of a moment she no longer honoured. Her hair was never dressed, her eyes never lined. Her body became less an adornment and more a prophecy of decay, of revolt, of truth no longer dressed in jewels. Rumours fermented in the air like spoiled incense. They said she had stopped speaking to her confessor, that she refused communion or worse, spat it out behind the chapel screen, that she whispered to the bones of saints, left coins on the altar for a God that was not theirs. Her writings, once innocent in their devotional tone, had turned inward, scrawled in margins, etched on walls, buried beneath folds of her gown. She wrote of hunger as virtue, of fire as witness, of a kingdom ruled by ghosts. In the margins of a book of hours she once adored, she penned the words, "I was wed to ash, not to man." The palace, gilded though it was, now trembled. Her presence sickened the court, not because she had become monstrous, but because she had become unrecognizable. A queen was meant to be still, a symbol, a reflection of male sovereignty gilded in silk. But she had stepped out of her frame. She was a moving portrait of collapse, dragging the legacy of her title through corridors where her perfume was replaced with the scent of scorched parchment and rosewater gone sour. She spoke less and less, and yet when she did, the words did not seem to come from her mouth. They seemed exhumed from somewhere deep beneath the stone. The king, burdened by whispers and alliances, did not act from fury. He acted from necessity. A queen who had begun to question was dangerous. A queen who had begun to believe was deadly. Heretics could be forgiven. Visionaries could not. A tribunal was summoned, cloaked in canonical pretense. Its purpose was not to discover truth, but to construct a scaffold of guilt upon which the monarchy could rest its conscience. Testimonies were gathered from trembling mouths. A maid who claimed she saw the queen baptize herself in ink, a priest who found thorns in her pillow, a physician who whispered that her womb had grown cold as marble. No one understood the crimes, but they understood the need for them. She was accused of spiritual treason, of making her mind a cathedral that did not bear the king's seal. Her gown, once a vestment of grace, was now evidence. The embroidery of lilies was interpreted as a secret alphabet. The stitches were unpicked and analyzed, as though they carried poison. Her silence at the tribunal was not passive. It was defiance carved into flesh. And when asked to kneel, she stood. When asked to confess, she breathed. It was enough. The verdict was already woven long before the trial had begun. She would die not as a queen, not as a wife, not even as a woman, but as a symbol to be immolated. And so it was decreed. She would be burned in the same dress in which she had wed the crown, a circle closed by fire, a ceremony devoured by its own sanctity. The priest did not bless her. He blessed the flame. The morning of her execution began like a vigil, not for her salvation, but for the spectacle of her unraveling. In the square that had once borne witness to coronations and victories, a scaffold had been erected with chilling precision, not a crude pyre hastily assembled by zealots, but a stage of ritual clarity, symmetrical, elevated, adorned with ecclesiastical flourishes to feign mercy while engineering agony. Timber soaked in lye, branches wound in thornbush, and a raised iron, great beneath the woodpile, whispered that this was no act of justice, but of orchestration. She would not die quickly. She would be seen. The queen was led from her chamber as though ushered toward a wedding once more, yet this time there were no hymns, only the weeping moan of wind through the cloisters. She wore the same dress, its hem matted with the ghosts of gardens, its sleeves frayed by time, its bodice now unable to clasp fully over a chest hollowed by starvation and grief. Her veil had turned yellowed at the edges, the illusion of innocence soured by knowledge. And her hair, once arranged in pearl-studded braids, now fell unbound like a curtain of mourning for a body not yet interred. As she moved through the palace corridor, courtiers looked away, not from pity, but from fear. To meet her eyes was to be forced to recognize her humanity, to admit that they were not watching the execution of a sinner, but the crucifixion of a question they dared not ask. At the threshold of the courtyard, she paused, not to resist, but to breathe, deeply, deliberately, as if to summon from within her a final act of defiance, presence. They tied her wrists with ceremonial ribbons once used to bind the hands of betrothed lovers. They spoke Latin words not of absolution, but of containment. She did not resist the cords, she resisted the narrative. Even bound, she stood with the quiet dignity of a saint whose shrine has been defiled. The executioner, a man chosen less for skill than for devotion, avoided her gaze, his own lips pale from whispered prayers. In his hands, a torch born of consecrated oil and splintered rosary beads. When flame met fabric, it was not an eruption, but a procession. The fire moved slowly at first, crawling like memory. The lace at her hem curled like old paper. Her fingers, still threaded in front of her as if in supplication, twitched once, only once, as the heat began to consume the sacred and the profane in equal measure. Her face remained uncovered. That was the order. The king had insisted. Her suffering must be a mirror to the people, a sermon carved in flesh. And yet her eyes did not plead. They glistened, not from pain, but from clarity, the kind that only appears in the final unmasking of power's theatre. Her skin blistered in silence. Her voice, when it came, was not a scream. It was a sound closer to singing, a single-held note that rose, not from the throat, but from the bones. It was not meant for the crowd. It was meant for the fire. A lament and a benediction in one. The silk gown, so carefully sewn by cloistered hands, became a shroud and a banner, catching light like a cathedral window ablaze. It took too long. That was the point. She did not faint. That, too, was the point. In the crowd, there were children who would remember the scent of that burning for the rest of their lives. There were priests who recited psalms without meaning, and there were women who clutched at their own sleeves, ashamed of their own skin. A pigeon landed briefly on the beam above the pyre and took flight again, its wings catching cinders, a symbol unbidden yet remembered. When finally the dress was no longer visible, only skin charred into parchment, the bishop gave the sign for bell tolls. Not one, not three, but 7, the number of holy sorrows, or holy sins. It no longer mattered. The Queen's body did not collapse. It remained upright for far too long, like a relic refusing to yield. When it fell, it did not fall forward in supplication, but sideways, like a statue pushed from its pedestal. Her crown, placed mockingly on her head for the ceremony, had melted hours before. Only the jewels survived, tumbling into ash like orphaned heirs. Smoke lingered long after the flame had died, not only in the courtyard, but in the lungs of the realm itself. It curled between the cathedral spires, clung to altar cloths and drifted into chalices before the wine could be poured. In villages far from the capital, where peasants ploughed frozen earth beneath relicless skies, the tale of the burning travelled faster than scripture, told in whispers too reverent to be mere gossip. They said the Queen did not scream. They said the fire recoiled once before devouring her. They said her bones would not blacken, only glow, all of it untrue, all of it true enough to haunt. At court, however, the mood was more clinical. Her death was noted in dispatches as a regrettable but necessary rite, a sacrifice to protect the sanctity of rule and the soul of the kingdom. Officials moved swiftly to purge her from the ledgers. Her name was struck from the marriage registry. Her crest, once etched into stained glass above the throne room, was replaced with a blank pane. The bishop who had anointed her was reassigned to a coastal diocese where tides erased footprints before they hardened. The palace seamstresses, instructed to destroy every gown she had worn, did so in silence, weeping not from grief but from fear of stitching the wrong memory into a future heirloom. The king, having delivered both union and punishment by the same hand, returned to state affairs with the poise of a man convinced of divine approval. Yet within a month, he ceased sleeping in the royal bedchamber. He claimed it was the draught. Others claimed it was the scent, an invisible perfume of scorched silk and singed marrow that clung to the mattress like a rebuke. He walked less, spoke more to his own reflection. During Mass, he gripped the pew with white knuckles and flinched at the phrase, "Communion of Saints." Twice he fainted during Lent. Once he struck a servant who simply resembled her in profile. Eventually, his ministers took to whispering his edicts aloud before putting them to ink, as if trying to coax clarity from a vessel slowly clouding with regret. But it was the people who proved least compliant. In the outer provinces, mothers began to name their daughters after her, not in full but in fragmented syllables. Isa, Lis, Reina, fragments that sounded harmless but carried the blood of resistance. Pilgrims began traveling to the site of her execution, leaving wildflowers and bits of lace soaked in oil. A mason etched her initials into a cathedral step, later covered by rushes but never erased. Children played games where they pretended to walk through fire without burning. And in convents far removed from the reach of the crown, cloistered nuns began embroidering white lilies into their hems, not as decoration, but as invocation. 2 winters after her death, a rumor spread that her heart had not been consumed, that it had remained intact within the ash, pulsing faintly before being seized by a guard and hidden in a reliquary too holy to name. No evidence ever surfaced, but the story grew teeth, gnawed at doctrine and unsettled bishops. Fire, they said, was final. It cleansed. It ended. But her fire had seeded something else, memory that did not fade, only smoldered. No statue was ever raised. No mass was ever sung. Yet her image remained, not in marble but in mirrors, in gowns gone out of fashion, in the pause between bell tolls where silence speaks louder than hymns. She had been burned for forgetting her place. And yet it was precisely that transgression which made her unforgettable. Years unraveled like old ribbon, frayed and forgetful, but her presence remained tethered to the kingdom not through lineage or law, but through sensation. There was no monument, no sanctioned rite to mark her passing, and yet the absence of such trappings became itself a monument. The space she had occupied, physically, politically, spiritually, grew larger with each attempt to silence it. In portraits, queens who followed her were painted with deliberate restraint, always seated, always draped in garments that avoided the shimmer of silk, lest the eye remember flame. Royal weddings, once spectacles of indulgence, were henceforth tempered in tone. No bride wore white for over 3 generations. The Church, wary of sanctifying rebellion, refused her martyrdom, but in denying her sainthood, they created a new category entirely, a relic of doubt. The priests who had condemned her aged poorly, not in body but in soul. Their sermons grew louder, their voices more strained, as though volume could drown the echo of what they had witnessed. Several went mad. One, it was said, began to hear. The rustle of fabric where none was worn, flinching at the sound of embroidered hems brushing against stone. He died whispering apologies to a name that no longer graced any altar. In quiet convents and forgotten abbeys, she became a study in paradox, heretical and holy, burned and preserved. A woman rendered sacred not by canon, but by contradiction. Nuns would stitch her likeness into the corners of tapestries meant to depict the Virgin Mary, altering the eyes just slightly, giving her that same defiant tilt of the chin. It was a heresy hidden in thread, a resistance woven in devotion. Mothers passed her story to daughters not as warning, but as torch, word by word, until it became ritual. She wore white not to be pure, but to be seen. She burned, and the sky did not forgive. The palace itself became a shrine of reluctance. Rooms once hers were locked, then bricked over. Her private garden, though salted, refused to die. Each spring it birthed lilies from the corners where shade lingered longest, petals ghost-white and bitter-scented. No gardener could explain it. No edict could stop it. The roses withered. The lilies remained. It was not beauty. It was refusal. The king eventually took to sleeping in a tower far from the chapel, his nights disturbed by the scent of old perfume and the faint sound of silk, unraveling itself in the dark. His health decayed without drama, only small humiliations, tremors in his hands, bleeding gums, a persistent weeping of the eye that no physician could cure. He died with a Bible in one hand and a letter in the other, its seal unbroken, its contents never known. When foreign emissaries asked about her, they were told she had died of illness. They were shown no tomb, no effigy, just a corridor left unlit, a wing of the palace where no one walked, where the stone remained cold no matter the season. But it was not forgetfulness that kept that hall silent. It was remembrance without language, an ache encoded in architecture, a wound built into the mortar, And still the stories shifted. In the south they said she had vanished before the fire could touch her. In the north they claimed her spirit walked barefoot across lake ice, her dress trailing vapor instead of flame. Children whispered that if you closed your eyes and stood barefoot on marble, you could feel the warmth of her final breath beneath your toes. None of it could be proven. All of it persisted. Legacy is rarely forged in truth alone. Often it is kindled in absence, fanned by guilt, carried by those whose hearts had no part in the crime, but every part in the memory. She became a myth not by choice, but by combustion. What they tried to destroy became precisely what endured. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of obedience and surrender, had been transformed in death into a relic of revolt. The image of her burning, unphotographed, unpainted, unrecorded, repeated itself endlessly in the mind's eye of a nation that dared not speak her name but could not forget her silhouette. Memory became ritual, and ritual became inheritance. And through that inheritance, her story ossified not in history, but in something older, colder, and far less forgiving. In one corner of the kingdom, a cathedral was constructed atop an old battlefield, carved into its northern wall behind layers of devotional script is a strange blemish in the stone, a swirl of chisel marks that no architect claimed. Some say it resembles the folds of a gown mid-motion. Others see flame frozen in ascent. Whatever it is, pilgrims touch it without speaking, and leave behind offerings of scorched ribbon, white cloth, or the delicate ash of paper prayers. No guard watches over them. No priest offers blessing. It is a liturgy of silence, born of grief, that outlived the body, and still she walks not in flesh but in echoes. Every time a bride hesitates before stepping into the aisle, every time a queen glances at her reflection and wonders whether her smile is hers or merely the state's, she walks. In the rustle of fabric in cathedrals where incense still clings, to old wood in the hush before a verdict, in the uneasy silence after applause she walks, not as ghost, not as angel, not as sinner, but as question, because no one truly knows what she believed, only that she stopped believing what she was told, that she stepped beyond the script and paid for it, not with obscurity, but with spectacle. Heresy had not damned her, fire had crowned her, and from that crown a question still burns: what becomes of a woman who sees the flame and does not flinch?